Have you ever wondered why, in the past, certain civilizations seemed to completely collapse in the face of climate stress, while others, facing similar challenges, they came back stronger than ever? Today, we'll look at this through the lens of drought, why different societies seem to be completely overwhelmed by it, while others found a way through and are still with us today, carrying this deeply embedded wisdom that they earned over time. Societal collapse following drought is not rare. The Akkadian Empire of Mesopotamia, the Old Kingdom of ancient Egypt, the Indus Valley of South Asia, all of these fell following major droughts that caused crop failure, famine, and economic distress amid an already destabilizing society. And when you hear about one of the most famous societies associated with the drought, specifically the classic Maya of Mesoamerica, you almost always hear the term collapse when describing their fate too. But did they really collapse? When we look closely at their history and their endurance, we don't see a sudden, helpless disappearance. We see a society that was challenged deeply by many interactive factors, and as we'll learn in today's episode, many of those factors involved water, either directly or indirectly, and the Maya embraced their connection to water, allowing them to transform into a thriving, vibrant culture today of more than 10 million people spread across southern Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, Honduras, and El Salvador. They had built across their civilization this deeply embedded resilience to climate stress, specifically by varying the many ways in which they stewarded water. And that is something we can all learn from today. I am a socio-hydrologist. I study the connections between humans and the water cycle. So when I started researching the Maya, I naturally started noticing these clues across the literature through this socio-hydrologic lens, and what I found is the basis of today's video. But what do you think about when you hear the word Maya? Do you think about very impressive architecture of limestone pyramids and temples in places like Chichen Itza or Tikal? Do you think about advanced calendars and astronomical predictions with immense precision, or complex and sophisticated writing, or deities and nobles covered in beautiful jade? Do you think about a massive civilization that mysteriously vanished and we don't know why? Perhaps abducted by aliens, as some conspiracy theorists would have us believe? The classic Maya were many impressive things, and they were also mysterious. They abandoned vast stone cities in the middle of an ancient rainforest in ways that still intrigue scholars and humanity today. Comment down below and let me know what you think about the Maya. So, who were they, according to the scholarship? They were a civilization that began somewhere around 2000 BC and rose to prominence across Mesoamerica between roughly 250 and 900 AD, which is often called the Classic Period or the Golden Age of the Maya. At their peak, the Maya would encompass over 200 cities, spread across 125,000 square miles, being home to somewhere between 10 and upwards of 16 million people. Then, during the 7th to 9th centuries, the classic Maya civilization began to destabilize, and many of their most prominent cities from the Golden Age were abandoned, particularly in the tropical rainforests of the Southern Lowlands. For centuries, many of these great cities sat completely forgotten beneath an encroaching jungle. It wasn't until 1839 that two explorers named John Lloyd Stephens and Frederick Catherwood pushed into the rainforest in Honduras and stumbled into one of the greatest rediscoveries of human history. What they saw was evidence of a civilization that had been building for nearly 4,000 years, with massive stone pyramids and palaces and ceremonial centers showing a highly advanced artistic and intellectual society. This discovery mattered far beyond archaeology, because the prevailing academic and intellectual consensus of the 19th century, particularly in Europe and the United States, was that the indigenous peoples of the Americas were considered less civilized than their counterparts, and some people thought they represented earlier stages of human and social development. Stevens and Catherwood challenged this notion directly in their famous book entitled Incidents of Travel in Central America, Chiapas, and Yucatan, written after several years of traveling and documenting the Maya region extensively. Stevens repeatedly argued that the ruins were not the work of some more civilized society that had apparently visited the region in the ancient past, but instead were the work of the ancestors of the indigenous Maya people that were still inhabiting the region. At this time, this claim was considered radical because it would mean that the indigenous societies were not primitive, but had developed their own sophisticated systems of government, mathematics, astronomy, architecture, and writing independently and on their own terms, in ways that by any measure rivaled the greatest powers of the era. Which meant that, in order to truly understand what humans were capable of achieving, scholars needed to understand the Maya, their origins, their history, how they built such a remarkable civilization, and what had become of it. And to understand the Maya, we must first understand the landscapes that they inhabited, because the Maya did not occupy a single type of environment. Their civilization stretched across vast ecosystems, including volcanic mountainous regions, dense tropical rainforests, flat limestone plains with underground river networks. They comprised one of the most hydrologically complex regions on Earth. And unlike many of the world's most famous ancient civilizations, the Maya were not organized around a single great river system, like the Nile or the Euphrates. Instead, they occupied a mosaic of landscapes, each with very different water features, representing unique challenges for finding, storing, and managing water long term. And this resulted in dramatically different waterscapes, a concept in the literature that describes the link between water, social organization, and political economy. Over thousands of years, the Maya had developed different adaptations to water in ways that would shape where the people lived, and how cities grew, and ultimately how their civilization endured. The first landscape we will talk about is the Volcanic Highlands. This rugged mountain range is in what is today southern Guatemala and Chiapas, Mexico. Scholars believe the Maya emerged from agricultural communities here between roughly 2000 and 1500 BC, along the Pacific coastal plains and adjacent highlands of this region. Here they inhabited rugged mountain landscapes where very heavy rainfall and volcanic springs under the ground fed these fast-moving rivers that cut through the deep valleys below. This access to fertile soil, rivers, springs, and seasonal rainfall helped support early farming communities, laying the foundations for the Maya civilization. Over time, archaeological evidence suggests that they developed increasingly sophisticated approaches to managing water in this region. But notably, they did this without high involvement of centralized or elite management. Instead, they organized into what scholars call waterhole groups, a hierarchy of local social units where mandatory maintenance was shared across the community and everyone had scheduled usage limits that were decided locally. And this is very much like some modern-day water use associations, which emphasize highly democratic decision-making around water in a bottom-up fashion. They also engineered the landscape to support the naturally local hydrology. They built these long agricultural terraces along the steep hillsides. They used walls of masonry or uncut stone running perpendicular to the slope. They flattened the land into a series of wide terraced steps. You see, during heavy tropical rainfall, water on a steep open hillside can sheet too fast across the surface, cutting channels and stripping the topsoil before it can infiltrate and feed plants. And the terraces they built strategically interrupted that process by reducing the slope gradient and slowing the runoff off long enough for water to penetrate the soil and feed the crops. Some communities even added unique irrigation channels directly onto the terraced beds to help cascade water gently down through a series of continuous holding ponds. It was a highly effective system, and it helped them feed a scattered settlement of agriculture and numerous homes. Over time, the Maya expanded northward and eastward into the heavily forested region called the Southern Lowlands. In these dense rainforests, precipitation could reach 160 inches per year, eventually draining into the Caribbean and the Gulfs through these massive river systems. However, nearly all of the rainfall arrived in a single strong wet season, followed by several months of almost no rain. This dry season every year would transform the landscape into a giant green desert. And to survive, the Maya designed their urban centers around the concept of rainfall harvesting. They constructed these massive centralized reservoirs that would capture the seasonal rain, store it, and so they could use it during the dry months ahead. At major cities like Tikal and Karakol, the entire orientation of the central portion of those cities was constructed to divert rainwater into the central reservoirs. They utilized strategically elevated terrain to create these convex micro-watersheds, where the urban areas themselves acted as giant rain barrels, collecting water in a central core that could then be distributed to outlying areas. Here, Maya kings claimed divine authority over the rain itself. Their power was rooted in the belief that, through different rituals and ceremonies, the kings could intercede with the gods and ensure that the water kept coming each year. And this centralized management was structured to consolidate strength and political power. The Maya royalty used the collection and maintenance of these giant reservoirs to bolster their ideological authority throughout the community. And as long as the rain came, it worked, and the system thrived, fueling the rise of magnificent cities during the Classic period, where populations here swelled into the millions. But this system came with immense social costs. The general populace had to spend huge amounts of time and labor constructing and maintaining these systems. And this created a growing dependence of water controlled by others. Population densities grew so massive that they were at or even beyond the natural carrying capacity of the landscape, and they relied almost exclusively on rainfall to recharge the reservoirs. And this growing demand from the increased population led to more need for forest products, which led to widespread deforestation of the tropical trees around. That deforestation weakened local precipitation recycling, which made the climate warmer and drier and amplified drought conditions that were already building across the region. Further north, the Maya settled along a vast expanse of porous limestone, where this soluble rock absorbed most of the limited rainfall. It was a more arid region here, and it left surface water very scarce. Instead, this area formed hundreds and hundreds of miles of underground rivers and cave systems beneath the flat limestone. This meant the Maya in the northern lowlands could not simply build their cities around rivers or lakes the way that most ancient civilizations did. Instead, in order to access the precious water, they clustered around cenotes, which are large circular sinkholes in the ground where the limestone had collapsed over time, exposing these subterranean aquifers. These cenotes provided practical access to water and were also considered highly sacred. In Maya cosmology, the cenotes were portals to an underwater realm where powerful deities dwelled. These were places where the boundary between the living world and the spirit world would easily dissolve. And in locations here without natural cenotes, the Maya would excavate into the bedrock and engineer their own massive subterranean systems called choltuns, which were bottle-shaped reservoirs lined with plaster to capture and store the rainwater. They also designed elaborate stone channels to funnel rainwater directly into their cities. And from a socio-hydrological stance, the social orders here were very different from that of the Southern Lowlands. Because there were fewer rivers and the water management relied heavily on these locally managed cenotes and choltuns, their political systems were much less formal and much less hierarchical than their counterparts to the south. Instead, they were naturally more democratic. So as you can see, the Maya had managed to survive across very different landscapes, adapting to water in unique ways in each according to their surroundings and lived experiences. By 250 AD, Maya society had entered its golden age, and for the next 6 centuries, the Maya stood as one of the most sophisticated civilizations on Earth, advancing science, architecture, and political structure in ways the world would not fully appreciate for centuries to come. The great cities of the central and southern lowlands, places like Tikal, Calakmul, Palenque, Copan, these were all at their height. Swelling populations, they were connected by trade, diplomacy, and a deeply shared cultural tradition. Here, powerful dynasties ruled, and their authority was intertwined with the very water systems that kept their communities alive. But beginning around 660 AD, records show a very long drying trend across the central lowlands. By 700 to 800 AD, the predictability of seasonal rainfall had drastically declined, making it very hard for farmers to time their plantings, even in years that weren't technically considered a drought. Politics began fragmenting and interstate warfare increased. Then, between roughly 800 and 1000 AD, a series of mega-droughts arrived. For a civilization whose entire political, social, and agricultural systems depended on rain reliably filling reservoirs, this was an existential crisis. They stopped constructing elaborate monuments, and royal dynasties began disappearing entirely from the historical record. People started experiencing severe malnutrition, reflecting chronic food shortage and the collapse of the region's agriculture. When the kings could no longer intercede with the gods to reliably bring the rain, their authority collapsed with it. As water became more scarce, competition between rival city-states intensified, evidenced by the sudden construction of defensive walls around cities that had never needed them before, and the rivers that had long carried trade across the Maya world ran lower and lower each dry season, slowly cutting these interior cities off from things like obsidian and jade and salt that had kept their civilizations and cultures alive. The great interior cities experienced major population loss. Some people did die, and many other people moved. They moved northward toward the Cenote country and southward into the highland valleys. And as those central cities disappeared into the jungle, other cities grew. Places like Chichen Itza and Uxmal flourished. Highland states continued developing sophisticated political orders for centuries more to come. You see, the Maya had not disappeared. Just the center of their world had shifted toward landscapes where people had already been learning to live with water differently, and where people had a very different social and spiritual connection to water and to each other. Each of these forces on the Maya transformation has its own evidence, but they aren't clean, separate variables. Drought depletes reservoirs, driving scarcity. Scarcity drives warfare. Warfare and dry rivers disrupt trade. And running underneath all of it, like a thread pulling the whole system along, is water. So what does that system actually look like when you map it out? In Sociohydrology, we use a tool called a causal loop diagram to map how variables in a human water system influence one another, and whether those influences push the system toward stability or toward collapse. We can start with drought, the environmental stressor at the heart of everything. Drought depletes the reservoirs that the society depend on, revealing internal vulnerabilities. Without more rainfall, the crops become stressed, eventually leading to food shortage. Food shortage drives political instability, which eventually escalates into conflict. Conflict and drought disrupt trade, further undermining political authority and straining the economy. This, coupled with less food, leads to reduced societal resilience and even greater vulnerability to drought. And as long as the system keeps moving in this direction, each variable amplifies the next, which amplify the one after, in a series of causal connections. They all point in the same direction until eventually the chain closes back in on itself, forming what we call a reinforcing loop. And without anything coming in to balance or offset this reinforcing pattern, the loops will just keep spinning and getting stronger and stronger with every turn, and driving the system further toward whatever direction it was already heading. And in this case, that direction is toward more drought vulnerability, more social fragility, and less capacity to absorb future shocks when they come. And there are two more loops in the system worth mentioning. The first is the Levee Effect, which scholars hypothesize may have been a strong contributing factor in the Maya transformation. You see, when faced with drought, even seasonally, communities may naturally respond by building these massive reservoirs to try and store and manage the water. Those reservoirs do increase water security, and over time, the security enables and spurs population growth. But when a mega-drought arrives, the reservoirs can no longer keep up with this much larger population. So crops become stressed, and with more mouths to feed, the food insecurity becomes even worse. And this amplifies overall vulnerability. The very infrastructure built to protect the society ends up amplifying their overall risk relative to not having built the reservoirs. The second loop is the tragedy of the commons. As populations grew and food demand increased, individual farmers made completely irrational decisions on the surface. They needed to feed their families, so they cleared more land and they farmed more aggressively. And no single farmer was doing anything wrong, but collectively, they modified the landscape in a major way, and this may have actually reduced the moisture cycling back into the atmosphere, making the regional climate warmer and drier and amplifying the very drought already devastating the system. You can see here multiple reinforcing loops all spinning in the same direction, and none of them contain any natural balancing forces strong enough to reverse this reinforcing trajectory once the mega-droughts arrive. But we know that's not the full story, because if the story ended there, it would just be a gloomy cautionary tale about human hubris and climate fate. But that would completely miss what modern research is telling us about what the Maya actually achieved, how they demonstrated profound resilience in the face of complex water challenges. You see, the Maya weren't just being acted upon by these external climate forces and their own self-reinforcing vulnerabilities, because embedded within that same system were the extraordinary acts of engineering and ecological intelligence and adaptation we talked about earlier that gave their civilization enough stability to avoid total collapse. Throughout their history, they had been building in this series of balancing causal factors, and it helped slow down parts of these reinforcing loops just enough to bring the coupled system back in the direction of stability so they didn't experience total civilization collapse. So in essence, the terminal classic decline was not the end of the Maya. It was a trigger that forced transportation of a coupled system through these embedded resilience factors that the Maya had been building into their relationship with water over centuries. And the real question we should be asking is not what caused the Maya to collapse, because they didn't. They're still here today, very much so. What we should be asking instead is, how does a civilization survive for over 4,000 years in one of the most hydrologically complex and challenging landscapes on Earth? Because that is what the Maya did by living inside of and connected to the water cycle. They shaped it and they were shaped by it over millennia. And if you found this useful, please like and subscribe. It genuinely will help this channel reach more people. And if you haven't seen the Tragedy of the Commons or the Levee Effect episodes, start there, because everything we just talked about here, these feedback loops between humans and water, are still playing out in real time throughout the world. Take care.